melodrama mood this morning. I don't quite know what that meant exactly, but I was just sort of interested to think there's other kind of qualities about the play itself that I thought were worthy of just sort of mentioning. Not that there were any conclusions about it or anything, but a lot of people always say, well, why the heck is the play called Julius Caesar? I mean, the guy dies halfway through the dang thing, and you know, he has 2 big scenes or whatever it is, and I mean, he has not very many lines, and you know, it's kind of like, why isn't it called Iago versus why is it called Othello, sort of thing, right? And the speculation about that is twofold. One is that often Shakespeare liked to sort of privilege the ruler, so that the title of the plays were sort of like the one who was kind of like the most in charge, which I think makes some sense to a certain degree. But more to the point is that regardless of, I mean, you know, it's that Julius Caesar doesn't exactly leave the stage, as it were, in the second half of the play, and that in some ways the journey of the play is kind of like who or what is Julius Caesar, that the play in some ways is kind of trying to answer that question, and how do you use that to create a different kind of society that is, we're on the cusp of, we're entering this play right on the cusp of going from one society into another. I mean, it's a great dramatic moment to choose, right? And so what are we going to end up being? And some of it has to be a response to who or what was Julius Caesar. Why did we herald him? Why did we privilege him? What about him? What are those qualities, who he was, that then set us up for the next stage? And also a kind of world beyond reason in a way, and this notion of ghosts and dreams and signs. All this stuff is starting to come up, and somebody also had written, made an interesting observation about this being the first play, kind of like halfway through his canon, that this is the first play that really starts to talk about dreams as, and the dreamlike stage. Yes, there's some of it in Midsummer Night's Dream, but from this point onward, dreams and sort of all these kinds of signs and all of this becomes an important part, a believable and real part of all the plays that happen after that. I mean, sort of got the Ghost and Hamlet to sort of, you know, carry forth next. And I thought that was sort of an interesting thing to think about, not just about it being on the surface logic, but actually that it had to do with the dream state and psychology and unconsciousness and all that kind of stuff that sort of begins to come in the world of, that we know of in sort of in the modern world. So all these things are just sort of interesting. And of course it's a Roman play, as I said earlier, which is a kind of history play, and trying to understand Roman history through the lens of his contemporary England. I think this is just a gesture that most people would have made pretty easily. Follows Titus, we said this already, and here's a moment, right? Oh, see, I'm all ahead of myself. So this is also, again, back to the earlier comment about, you know, what does Shakespeare know versus what we know. And of course, it's very hard for all of us when we enter these places not to say, well, we know that. So if you can't put me in pumpkin pants and go back in the Wayback, you know, Mr. Sherman's Wayback Machine, and I can't pretend, you know, 600 people cannot pretend as if these events didn't happen. You know what I mean? So in that translation from the two-dimensional art object, which has inscribed its own time and place, artists cannot not respond to their own time. But that is the artistic gesture, right? That you're doing it in a particular aesthetic, formal way to respond to your own time and place. Some of us just go to Martino's. But some people of us go to Martino's and we write plays, which is what I think Shakespeare was doing. But you cannot not respond. That's sort of the curse of the artist, right? So in whatever, and it is inscribed in this two-dimensional art object, that just like James Shapiro was talking about in the 1599 book, all these things that happen in 1599 that are literally end up in Julius Caesar. You think it's like, oh, he made up something. So I've often had this theory, he made up a lot of that stuff, because people say, well, how could he know what happened, you know, in the Privy Council, because he wasn't a man of royalty or high social standing. He wouldn't have had access to that. And I say, have you ever really read those scenes? You know, it's like, Your Majesty, how are you? I mean, they're not that specific. I mean, like the things I made up in 3rd grade, right? About how to be a king and queen. I mean, really, really read them. Because they don't have anything specific in them. You know, they're just kind of made up protocols. So I'm like, nah, I don't buy that particularly. But it's interesting to sort of think about how he, what he did know about and using it, you know, in these plays itself. So
It's one of the plays where mostly single source, meaning this guy's Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which had just been translated in like 1587 or something like that. So it's relatively new and been printed 1591 and then reprinted 1598 or something like that. So it's possible that he saw it, but you know, we don't have that book where he has his little crib notes in it. It's one of the great things about Lorraine Hansberry. You can see the books that she read when she was writing Les Blancs, and her conversations with, it's like, I don't agree with that, and I think she's written all over the margin. It's really kind of fun. So someday we're going to find that urn where he has written in all these margins about, you know, how he feels about stuff. But it's kind of a single source in some ways, that it was the Parallel Lives and not the Hollingshed Chronicles, as you know, which is sort of the source for all those history plays. And, you know, here again, this is sort of the character of Brutus, that he gets really much from Parallel Lives. And the parallel means that this guy is comparing leaders in Greece with the leaders of Rome. That's sort of what the parallel is, just sort of this comparative thing. And then you get to add this extra dimension of sort of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, sort of comparing them with them as well. And it's kind of an interesting, so for an Elizabethan audience, that sort of set up to then you're being asked to, or you are allowed to compare those things to your leader, was kind of implied, which is kind of great, isn't it? And we sort of do it anyway, don't we? We think we do. So when we choose to do a play, we choose to do especially a Shakespeare play in contemporary dress, we're assuming and we're hoping that people will make that comparative leap, right? That's by theatrically sort of pushing us to do that. All right. And the whole sin of the poet scene, which is not in the Plutarch at all. This is something that Shakespeare makes up. There's very few scenes in Julius Caesar that he actually makes up, but this is one of them. And speculation about this is that it is about the next slide, which says what? No, right, okay, well, right. Hold on to censorship. Just hold on to censorship and silencing for a second. Anyway. Again, back to this notion of kind of, you can see my bios, I really disjointed this morning. Ancient Rome or Elizabethan England, that whole notion of linking together, right? That whole triumphant thing. The speculation was that Caesar actually built the tower, right? This was the myth, right? So you have all of this around London. Rome is not far away. Again, this is the whole point about it's not being Rome. Brutus funds Britain. Again, another myth, right? So this is all in the air and circulating. And all these kind of topical references in the particular play itself. In the original play it says the 1st of March, and everybody thinks that he really meant the 15th of March, as in the Ides of March, but what he really meant was the 1st of March, and Elizabethan England would have known the joke. Which, of course, we don't really know the joke. And you can't stop the play and have the dramaturg pop up and say, this is why this is a joke. Because in 1599 we would have known, blah, blah, blah. So we've always changed it to the Ides of March because it's something we all kind of learn from history, you know, our history classes, right? And this whole notion, I love to kind of point out anachronisms in Shakespeare because everyone says, you know, he doesn't know his coastline, he doesn't know his geography, he doesn't know, it's like, yeah, right. There's a point for why he doesn't, or no, he doesn't want to, but there's clock striking in this particular play, and people go, well, there were no clocks in ancient Rome. I was like, no, the point is it's about today, and there were clocks 400 years ago, right? It's deliberate to remind us that this is this comparative thing smashed on top of. So it's a beautiful sort of very subtle reference about, about today, not about the History Channel version of what Julius Caesar was all about, okay?